Hey everyone, Catlin Moore here, and what I'm about to show you should absolutely terrify anyone who's ever depended on American manufacturing. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the industry that built your entire state, that employed millions of families for over a century, that made your cities world famous. Imagine discovering that industry is now abandoning you, not slowly declining, not gradually shifting, completely walking away and taking everything with it. We're talking about Michigan, the state that invented the American automobile, the birthplace of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, the state where assembly lines changed the world and created the middle class as we know it. And today, right now, those same companies are shutting down factories, laying off workers by the tens of thousands, and moving production to other states and other countries like Michigan never even mattered. This isn't some temporary downturn. This isn't a recession that'll bounce back. This is the systematic dismantling of an entire state's economic foundation. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why state officials are genuinely panicking behind closed doors, and why what's happening in Michigan could be coming to your state next. So hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see American manufacturing forever. Let's get into it. Picture this. For over 100 years, Michigan was synonymous with American automotive power. Detroit wasn't just a city, it was the Motor City, the arsenal of democracy, the place where American ingenuity turned steel and rubber into the machines that mobilized the world. At its peak, Michigan's auto industry employed over 400,000 workers directly. 400,000. That's just the assembly line workers, engineers, and factory staff. When you add suppliers, parts manufacturers, logistics workers, dealerships, and support services, you're talking about an ecosystem that sustained over 2 million jobs. The numbers? They're staggering. In the year 2000, Michigan produced over 5 million vehicles annually. 5 million. That's more cars and trucks than any other state in the Union by a massive margin. The big three automakers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, had their headquarters, their research centers, their major assembly plants all concentrated in Michigan. The state collected billions in corporate taxes. Workers earned solid middle-class wages with benefits and pensions. Entire cities existed solely to support auto manufacturing. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where you need to pay attention. Today, right now, as I'm recording this, that dominance has collapsed catastrophically. Michigan's share of U.S. vehicle production has plummeted below 15%. 15%. From the overwhelming majority to barely a fraction. Assembly plants that once ran 3 shifts around the clock now sit empty, stripped of equipment, with weeds growing through cracked parking lots. Let me paint you a picture of what this transformation actually looks like, because the visual tells a story that statistics alone can't capture. Picture massive industrial complexes that sprawled across hundreds of acres, buildings so large you could fit entire football fields inside them. Assembly lines where robotic arms and skilled workers collaborated to build vehicles from raw metal to finished product. The constant hum of machinery, the organized chaos of production, the pride of workers who knew they were building something that mattered. Employment offices with lines of applicants hoping for that union job that would support a family for generations. Now imagine walking through those same facilities today. The machinery is gone, sold off to factories in Mexico or China. The assembly lines sit silent and rusting. Broken windows let in rain and snow. Graffiti covers walls where motivational posters once hung. The parking lots that once held thousands of workers' cars are empty except for scattered debris. What was once the beating heart of American industrial might is now just abandoned real estate, monuments to a manufacturing era that's dying before our eyes. And if you think that's just the natural evolution of industry, you're missing the bigger story that's unfolding. Here's what makes this situation so much more serious than just normal business cycles or market changes. Michigan's auto industry collapse isn't happening in a vacuum. This is part of a deliberate pattern of policy decisions, corporate strategies, and systemic failures that have been building for decades. And the implications are absolutely massive for anyone who depends on American manufacturing for their livelihood. Let me take you back to understand how we got here, because Michigan didn't just randomly lose its auto industry. This was years, decades even, in the making. Go back to the 1970s and 80s. That's when the warning signs first appeared. Japanese automakers started eating into American market share with more reliable, fuel-efficient vehicles. Instead of innovating aggressively, Detroit's Big Three doubled down on gas-guzzling SUVs and trucks, betting that oil would stay cheap and American consumers would stay loyal forever. Fast forward to the 1990s and early 2000s. Globalization accelerated. NAFTA opened the door for manufacturers to move production to Mexico, where labor costs were a fraction of Michigan wages. Initially, companies promised it would just be some parts manufacturing, some final assembly for Mexican markets. But the trickle became a flood. More and more production shifted south of the border, while Michigan plants got older, less competitive, and more expensive to operate. Then came 2008. The financial crisis hit, and it hit Michigan like a sledgehammer. General Motors and Chrysler had to be bailed out by taxpayers to survive. The bailout came with conditions: restructuring, plant closures, massive layoffs. Michigan lost over 150,000 direct auto manufacturing jobs in just 2 years. 150,000. Entire cities that depended on single factories saw their tax bases evaporate overnight. Unemployment in some Michigan communities hit 25% or higher, not in the same numbers, not with the same wages, because companies had learned they could produce vehicles elsewhere cheaper, with fewer regulations and with more government incentives. States in the South started aggressively courting auto plants with massive tax breaks, right-to-work laws that weakened unions, and promises of cheap labor. Mexico continued building state-of-the-art facilities. And Michigan watched as its century-long dominance just slipped away. The consequences? They rippled through the state faster than anyone could contain. 2023. This is when Michigan's auto manufacturing crisis entered a new phase that forced even the most optimistic observers to admit the state was in serious trouble. General Motors announced they were closing the historic Orion Assembly Plant, a facility that had been building vehicles for over 30 years. The plant employed over 1,000 workers making the Chevrolet Bolt electric vehicle. GM said they were restructuring for the electric future, and those jobs would be redeployed. Translation: the plant closed, most workers got laid off, and production moved to facilities in Tennessee and Mexico. 1,000 high-paying manufacturing jobs gone. But Orion wasn't an isolated case. That same year, Ford announced they were significantly reducing production at several Michigan facilities, while simultaneously announcing a $3.5 billion investment in a new electric battery plant in Marshall, Michigan. Sounds good, right? Michigan getting new auto jobs? Here's the reality. The new battery plant would employ just 2,500 workers. Meanwhile, Ford was cutting production at facilities that employed over 10,000 workers combined. Net result? Massive job losses disguised as investment in the future. Stellantis, the company that owns Chrysler, Jeep, and Ram, kept their headquarters in Auburn Hills, but moved massive amounts of production to plants in Mexico, Canada, and now even further afield. The Jeep Cherokee, once proudly assembled in Belvidere, Illinois, still Great Lakes region, got moved to Mexico. The Grand Cherokee, built in Detroit for decades, saw production split with a new plant in Mexico handling increasing percentages. Now, if you're not familiar with how auto manufacturing works as an ecosystem, let me break this down. Each assembly plant doesn't just employ the workers you see building vehicles. Every assembly plant creates demand for hundreds of supplier companies. Companies making seats, dashboards, electronics, glass, tires, paint, fasteners. The list goes on forever. When an assembly plant closes, it triggers a cascade of supplier closures. Tier 1 suppliers lose contracts and lay off workers. Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers that fed the Tier 1 suppliers lose orders too. Small machine shops, tool and die makers, logistics companies. Everyone connected to that plant suffers. The math is brutal. For every direct assembly job lost, economists estimate another 6 to 7 jobs disappear in the supply chain. So when GM closes a plant with 1,000 workers, the real job loss is 7,000 or more across the entire ecosystem. When multiple plants close or reduce production simultaneously, you're talking about tens of thousands of jobs vanishing from communities already struggling to survive. And here's what's really concerning. Michigan's response capacity has been completely overwhelmed. The state simply doesn't have the resources to retrain displaced workers, attract new industries at the necessary scale, or compete with the incentive packages that southern states and foreign countries are offering to steal Michigan's remaining auto investments. This wasn't a gradual adjustment that officials could manage with standard economic development tools. This was an avalanche that buried Michigan's manufacturing economy before the state could even react. But manufacturing closures weren't the only pressure building on Michigan. Let's talk about the policy environment that accelerated this exodus. And this is where things get really interesting from a political perspective because Michigan has been caught in a policy trap that's pushing manufacturers away, while simultaneously making it impossible to attract new investment. Start with taxes and regulations. Michigan has some of the highest business taxes in the region. Corporate income taxes, property taxes on manufacturing equipment, regulatory compliance costs, they all add up. Companies looking to build new facilities or expand operations compare Michigan's tax burden to states like Tennessee, Alabama, or South Carolina, which offer years of tax abatements, free land, infrastructure improvements, and worker training programs paid for by state governments desperate to attract manufacturing jobs. Michigan tried to compete with these incentive packages. The state offered tax breaks and grants to keep auto plants open. But here's the problem. Michigan's budget was already strained from decades of manufacturing decline. When your tax base is shrinking because companies are leaving, you can't afford to give away the store to keep the remaining companies from leaving too. It's a death spiral. Cut taxes to attract business, lose revenue, cut services, make the state less attractive, lose more business. Energy costs hit Michigan particularly hard. Manufacturing, especially auto manufacturing, consumes enormous amounts of electricity. Michigan's energy costs are higher than competing states due to aging infrastructure, regulatory requirements, and the transition away from coal without adequate replacement baseload power. Companies doing the math on where to build new electric vehicle battery plants or next-generation manufacturing facilities see Michigan's electricity costs and look elsewhere. Labor policy became a flashpoint. Michigan had been a union stronghold for over a century. The United Auto Workers Union negotiated strong contracts with good wages, health care, and pensions. That was great for workers, but made Michigan labor costs among the highest in the nation. Southern states passed right-to-work laws, crushed union organizing, and offered manufacturers workforces that would accept lower wages with fewer benefits. Michigan tried to resist becoming a right-to-work state, eventually caved under pressure in 2012, but the damage was done. The state lost its identity as a union stronghold without gaining the low-cost labor advantage that might have kept some manufacturing competitive. Environmental regulations added another layer of cost. Michigan's proximity to the Great Lakes meant strict water quality standards. Air quality regulations for manufacturing facilities were more stringent than many competing states. These regulations were designed to protect public health and the environment. Noble goals. But for manufacturers making location decisions based purely on profit, every regulation was another reason to build elsewhere. Infrastructure decay compounded all of these problems. Michigan's roads are famously terrible, among the worst in the nation. Bridges are crumbling. Freight rail capacity is inadequate. The state needed massive infrastructure investment to remain competitive for manufacturing, but the money wasn't there. Meanwhile, states courting auto investment built brand new highway interchanges, rail spurs, and logistics hubs specifically designed to serve new manufacturing facilities. All of these policy factors created a perfect storm where Michigan became increasingly uncompetitive for manufacturing investment while simultaneously losing the manufacturing base that had sustained the state for a century. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in economic statistics and policy discussions: the human element of this manufacturing collapse. Because we're not just talking about factories closing. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people whose entire lives were built around an industry that's now abandoning them. Think about the auto worker who started at GM right out of high school in 1995. 28 years on the assembly line. Solid middle-class wage, good benefits, defined benefit. Pension waiting at retirement. That worker bought a house in Flint or Warren or Dearborn, raised kids, coached Little League, volunteered at church, built a life around the stability of that auto job. Now, at 50 years old, the plant closes. What's the next move? Retrain for what? Tech jobs that don't exist in Michigan in meaningful numbers? Service industry jobs paying a fraction of the auto wage? Relocate to another state, leaving behind the only community they've ever known? The statistics are heartbreaking. Research shows that workers displaced from manufacturing jobs suffer average wage losses of 20 to 30% when they find new employment. Many never find comparable work again. They exhaust unemployment benefits, burn through savings, lose their homes. Families break apart under financial stress. Mental health crises spike. Substance abuse follows despair. These aren't abstract economic numbers. These are real people dealing with catastrophic life disruptions through no fault of their own. And it's not just the workers themselves. Think about the downstream effects. The local restaurants and shops that depended on auto workers' paychecks. When the workers lose their jobs, those small businesses fail. The property values in neighborhoods where auto workers lived, they collapse when nobody can afford to buy houses. The tax base for schools, police, fire departments, road maintenance, all of it evaporates when the major employer leaves town. Detroit's population tells the story. In 1950, Detroit had 1.8 million residents, making it America's fifth largest city. Today, under 700,000. The city lost over 60% of its population as auto manufacturing declined. Entire neighborhoods sit abandoned. Whole square miles of urban landscape returned to prairie. The city went bankrupt in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. But Detroit isn't unique. Flint, once home to major GM facilities and a thriving middle class, saw similar population collapse and economic devastation. The infamous Flint water crisis was a direct consequence of the city's declining tax base and inability to maintain basic infrastructure after GM scaled back operations. When you can't afford to maintain your water system properly, people get poisoned. That's what manufacturing collapse looks like in human terms. Saginaw, Pontiac, Bay City, Michigan City after Michigan City followed the same trajectory. Manufacturing jobs disappeared, population fled, tax base collapsed, services degraded, remaining residents suffered, more people left. The downward spiral feeds on itself. The psychological impact on entire communities has been profound. Michigan cities that once had civic pride, strong community identity, and optimism about the future now struggle with collective hopelessness. When multiple generations saw parents and grandparents retire with dignity from auto jobs and now see no such future for their own children. Something fundamental breaks in the community's sense of possibility. So, how has Michigan's state government responded to this manufacturing apocalypse? Well, let's just say the response has been complicated. And by complicated, I mean largely ineffective in stopping the bleeding while occasionally making things worse through conflicting priorities. State officials have tried multiple approaches. They've offered tax incentives to keep manufacturers from leaving. They've invested in worker retraining programs to help displaced auto workers transition to new industries. They've attempted to attract new types of manufacturing, electric vehicles, batteries, advanced technology. They've promoted economic diversification, trying to build up sectors like healthcare, tourism, and technology to replace lost manufacturing jobs. Some of these efforts have shown modest results. Michigan has attracted some electric vehicle investment, though far less than states like Georgia, Tennessee, and even Nevada. Retraining programs have helped some workers transition, though success rates are much lower than politicians like to admit. Economic diversification has happened to a degree, with Detroit's downtown seeing some revitalization through tech startups and healthcare expansion. But here's the fundamental problem. The scale of job creation from these new initiatives is nowhere close to the scale of manufacturing job loss. When GM closes a plant employing 1,500 workers and the state celebrates attracting a tech company that will create 200 jobs over 5 years, that's not solving the problem. That's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. State officials found themselves caught between impossible choices that paralyzed effective action. The business community demanded lower taxes and fewer regulations to compete with other states. Labor unions demanded protection of wages and working conditions. Environmental advocates pushed for stricter rules on manufacturing emissions. Communities demanded services and infrastructure investment. And the state budget simply couldn't fund all of these competing demands while also offering the massive incentive packages that might keep auto manufacturers from leaving. Political divisions made coherent strategy even harder. Republican lawmakers pushed for right-to-work laws and corporate tax cuts, arguing that making Michigan more business-friendly would stem the tide of departures. Democratic lawmakers resisted undermining unions and pushed for infrastructure investment and education funding. The result was policy paralysis and piecemeal responses that satisfied nobody, while the manufacturing base continued eroding. The most frustrating aspect for state officials has been competing with other states and other countries that can offer incentives Michigan simply can't match. When Mexico offers auto manufacturers access to cheaper labor, less regulation, and proximity to American markets through NAFTA and USMCA, what can Michigan realistically offer to compete? When southern states offer decade-long tax abatements and free land, how can a cash-strapped Michigan match those packages? Some officials have been brutally honest about the challenges, at least privately. They acknowledge that Michigan may never return to its automotive manufacturing dominance, that the industry has fundamentally changed, with global supply chains, automation reducing labor needs, and production shifting to locations with better economics. But publicly, they maintain optimism and promise revitalization that most policy experts know isn't coming. So here we are. Michigan, the state that invented the American auto industry, the state that armed democracy in 2 world wars, the state that created the American middle class through manufacturing jobs. This state is watching its foundational industry walk away. The question now isn't whether Michigan can return to its former manufacturing glory. That ship has sailed. The question is whether Michigan can manage this decline without complete economic collapse. Can the state find new industries to replace lost manufacturing? Can displaced workers be retrained in meaningful numbers? Can communities survive the loss of their major employers? Can the tax base stabilize enough to maintain basic services? Here's what we know for certain. Without massive intervention, and I mean massive, on the scale of the New Deal or the Marshall Plan, Michigan faces decades of continued decline. Population loss will continue as young people leave for opportunities elsewhere. The tax base will keep shrinking as businesses close and property values fall. Infrastructure will continue deteriorating without revenue to maintain it. Schools will suffer from reduced funding. Healthcare access will decline in struggling communities. Some Michigan cities may find paths to reinvention. Detroit's downtown has seen some success attracting young professionals and new businesses. Ann Arbor's university and tech presence provides some economic stability. Grand Rapids has diversified into healthcare and business services. But for every modest success story, there are multiple cities in terminal decline with no clear path forward. The national implications of Michigan's manufacturing collapse are enormous. If the state that built American automotive power can't maintain that industry, what does that say about American manufacturing competitiveness generally? When companies can build factories anywhere in the world, connected by global supply chains and free trade agreements, why would they choose high-cost American locations? What happens to communities across America that depend on manufacturing when every company is making the same calculation Michigan automakers made? Michigan has become a test case for post-industrial America. The whole country is watching what happens when an economy built on manufacturing has to transition to something else. If Michigan succeeds in reinventing itself, it provides a blueprint for other states facing similar challenges. If Michigan continues declining into a permanent underclass of economically devastated communities, that's a warning sign for manufacturing-dependent regions everywhere. So here's what we've uncovered in this investigation. Michigan's auto manufacturing collapse wasn't just bad luck or inevitable economic evolution. This was the result of decades of policy failures, corporate decisions prioritizing short-term profits over long-term community stability, and global economic forces that Michigan simply couldn't compete against. The factories are closing, the jobs are disappearing, entire communities are being hollowed out, and the state government, despite various attempts at intervention, hasn't found a way to stop the bleeding. This is where you come in. If you live in Michigan or any state that depends on manufacturing, this directly affects your future, your job security. I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below and tell me, is American manufacturing dead? Can Michigan recover? Have you been affected by manufacturing job losses? What should the government do, if anything? Let's have a real conversation about this in the comments. And if you found this investigation valuable, smash that like button and subscribe to Caitlin Moore because I'm going to keep following this story and the industrial decline happening across America. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Remember, these economic changes don't happen in isolation. They affect real people, real families, real communities. So share this video, tag your representatives, and let's make sure this story doesn't get buried under the next news cycle. I'm Caitlin Moore, investigating the stories that affect your daily life. Michigan's manufacturing crisis is real. The solutions are complicated, but we need to be having these conversations. See you in the next investigation.